As I sat on the floor of my bedroom, the world around me blurred. To say I was exhausted is an understatement. Until earlier this week, I never imagined that I would be here, in this moment, doing what I was doing. Sitting up, I could feel the texture of the carpet on my damp hands. A few years ago, Kelly and I had spent a lot of money to furnish our bedroom. It had a decent floor and a quality Australian wool rug. Too bad the carpet was ruined now. I closed my eyes for a moment and shook my head slightly, trying to dispel the fog that had descended on my mind. What the hell am I doing? I thought. I'm better than this. I thought for a moment. Opening my eyes, I looked at the large double wooden framed bed. When I blinked the next time, a vision of Kelly appeared in front of me. I shuddered, realizing it would never happen again. Events were now spiraling out of control. I brought my hands up to my face and grinned madly as I watched the warm, wet blood on my hands smear across my face. I brought my hands down to my sides again, continuing to ruin the carpet with the moisture leaking out of me. The world around me was blurring, but my eyes quickly caught the glow of a half-empty whiskey bottle lying on the bed next to an empty pill bottle. Dropping the bottle and swallowing the pills, I had forgotten to put the cap back on. Now the smell of whiskey filled the room. I laughed bitterly and shrugged, but immediately a panicked thought flashed through my mind. Letters. I quickly turned my head and saw they were still there, my bad handwriting on the cover of each envelope. They were on the bedside table, not on the mattress as I'd thought a few minutes ago, where an open bottle could have destroyed them. There was always the risk that the wrong person would find my letters, but I dismissed the thought as soon as it crossed my mind. The only sane part of my brain realized that I wouldn't be around to worry about it, so what could I do? I coughed briefly, feeling the bile rising in my stomach. I didn't feel like throwing up, so I fought the feeling. Why? Closing my eyes again, I asked myself, why did things happen this way? Why did I have to act this way? Of course, there were people I would miss, though I don't think they would miss me. Of course, my daughter would hate me for acting like this, but I considered that she already hated me, having thrown me aside in disgust last week, and in turn, I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want this pain anymore. Even now, as the vital fluid circulating in our bodies continued to drain out of me, ruining the carpet, the pain and suffering still remained. The man I was a week ago would have flogged me for something like this the following week. The person I was then wouldn't have gone to such lengths, but I wasn't that person anymore. I was broken, unwanted, despised, and saw no other option but to give them all what they wanted. I closed my eyes and grimaced again at the pain in my wrists, but thanks to the pills and whiskey, it was dull rather than sharp, debilitating pain. As I sank into eternal sleep, my life did not flash before my eyes, and there were no light tunnels or staircases colored a foreboding red in the darkness. I was somewhat surprised. I must have been expecting something. No, it was wrong because I knew I was moments away from the end. I felt a sense of dread. The struggle of my synapses trying to put together coherent thoughts was coming to an end. My brain was trying to hold on to life, even though I could no longer stop the inevitable march towards doom. I felt stupid now. I wanted to survive. With my last effort to come to terms with my stupidity, I tried to move but felt myself falling to the floor without strength as the blackness finally engulfed me. A week earlier, I had laughed happily as I circled my daughter Grace around our suburban home in the center of Perth, Australia. She was 19 and her boyfriend John had proposed to her last night. Of course, I knew it was going to happen. He sought me out and asked me privately if I would give my blessing. I said yes without reservation. Grace and John had been dating since 8th grade in middle school, and I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of times they hadn't been together on one weekend or another since they started dating. Grace told my wife, Kelly, and me about the proposal. John sent her on a treasure hunt, took her all over town, and then brought her under a tree in Kings Park where he proposed. I hugged her and spun her around like she was 5 years old when they told us the next day in the kitchen. I was so happy for them. Even though they were young, I knew their love was strong. I believe that if there was a young couple in our time who had the courage to do it, I believe these two could do it. I took my daughter's hand again and smiled as I looked at the engagement ring. It's beautiful, Gracie. I looked at John. You did a good job picking it out. My wife Kelly snorted, sitting on the other side of the kitchen counter. In her 42 years, Kelly was still a beautiful woman in my eyes. She was a deep brunette with brown hair, brown eyes, and a tanned complexion that many women dream of. We all turned to watch as she snorted in response to my compliment. "You should thank me," my wife said, raising her wine glass. "You may be blessed, but I was the one who helped John choose him." I was shocked and noticed that John was blushing brightly. "Mom, that was inappropriate," Grace said, and then turned to her fiancé. "It's okay, baby. I like it, and I know you've made the final choice." Nothing more was said, but I have to admit I felt a little awkward about Kelly's comment. In all our years together, I had never once seen my wife say something so disrespectful and out of character as to embarrass everyone in the room. But upon reflection, it's safe to say that Kelly had been acting a little strange over the past few months. I couldn't pinpoint anything at the time, but there were little things, comments, and behaviors that didn't sound like the natural loving woman I knew, and that seeped into the woman who had just embarrassed us. Dinner was festive, and we continued to toast and celebrate the engagement. Finally, Grace and John headed out after a dessert of apple crumble and vanilla custard that I had made the day before. They had a small one-bedroom apartment that they had rented with our help while they were in school and pursuing their careers. I didn't say anything that night when Kelly and I went to bed, but I have to admit that that inappropriate comment never left my mind. Sunday morning, Kelly and I woke up slowly, not really thinking about the previous day. We got down to business and then suddenly shifted our gaze to her as she just walked off to the bathroom, leaving me there unfinished. I was stunned. "Kelly?" I said, "Oh, what's the matter?" She replied in a slightly annoyed voice from the bathroom. "Is there anything for me?" I asked. A minute passed before I heard the reply, "I'm already getting cleaned up." It took me about half an hour to gather my thoughts, so shocked was I. I took a shower, and when I walked into the kitchen, Kelly was gone. She had just left a note saying she was going to leave. Suddenly, I was angry. In all the years I had known Kelly, she had never been as disrespectful to me as she had been this morning. I had no idea what was going on with my wife. I made myself some coffee and kept coming back to the same thought, is she really cheating on me? I was finishing my coffee, pondering that question, when I got a call from Roger, one of my closest friends. "Yo, Bart, what's up?" he chirped. "What's up?" I answered the call with nothing more than a casual greeting. "Bart, buddy, what's up? Is something wrong?" Roger said. I said that. I spent the next 10 minutes explaining my thoughts to Roger. Roger laughed at me. "Buddy, if she's cheating on you, there's not much you can do. Divorce is 50-50 and she's out of work, so she'll take you to the cleaners," he said. "It won't help," I replied, a little pissed off at his attitude. "I wasn't. I was trying to be realistic," said a very unsympathetic Roger. "Look, why don't we sit down and talk about this tomorrow at work? We're supposed to have a report on the Pembroke project. We can discuss everything afterward." "Sounds good," I replied, without much enthusiasm. Roger was not only a good friend of mine, but we also worked for the same company. I was the senior engineer and he was the program manager. Over the years, we developed a good team. I created the solutions and he managed the funds and schedule. Somehow I made it through Sunday. Kelly came home, but by the time she got into bed, it was almost midnight. She didn't say anything, even though she knew I was awake. The next day, Kelly tried to be nice. It's not going to happen, Kelly," I said, getting out of bed. "Are you saying no?" she replied, looking at me incredulously. I stared at her, then started putting on my suit for the day. "I won't touch you after your disrespect for me last weekend. I swear, if you cheat on me." I blushed, having no idea how to finish the thought. "You'll do what Bartholomew the Other does. There's not a damn thing you can do." When she said my full name, a slight chuckle appeared on her face. It softened a little, but it didn't disappear completely. "Look, go back to bed. I need a release, and I'm sure you can do it too." She tried to talk me into it. I shook my head. Who the hell was this woman? "No, you can't, Kelly. I don't think you realize the absolute contempt you're showing me." "Well, screw you," she said. I shook my head and left the room. For the first time in 21 years of marriage, I was disgusted with my wife. That morning at the office, I was all worked up. My assistant Myra looked at me worriedly. "Bart, are you all right? You look out of sorts," she said with concern on her forehead. Myra Brown has been my assistant at work for 10 years. She likes to say she was hired out of charity when she tells me about it. When Myra joined the company, her boyfriend bullied her. After the breakup, when Myra had to leave home, she showed up for her interview with a black eye, desperate to apply for a secretarial position. Except for the bruise at the interview, which quickly went away, Myra was quite suitable for the job. She dressed conservatively in general, but it was hard to hide the fact that she looked amazing. Myra was very intelligent, easily understood almost everything we did, was witty as all around. The owner of the firm hired her but assigned her to me, deciding that Myra didn't have the brains to keep up with me when I was doing projects. I respected Myra also because she genuinely cared about everyone around her and had an absolute moral code. She treated you friendly until you crossed her, then you were dead to her. People were removed from the company because they crossed her, or thought she was just a stupid pretty girl, and then they found out that her anger was not to be trifled with. I looked at Myra, deciding what to say about the situation with Kelly. I finally sighed and told her the truth. Myra frowned for a few moments after starting the story, but by the end of it, an angry blush ran down her neck. After the story, I hung my head, somewhat depressed that my wife might be cheating on me. I don't know what to do, Myra. If she's cheating on me, I didn't expect it, I said sadly. Suddenly, I felt Myra's hand on my shoulder. In all our years together, I could count the amount of physical contact we had had on the fingers of both hands. I lifted my head and looked into the compassion-filled eyes. Well, Myra said, first, you need to go through the meeting at Pembroke. I got the schedule a few minutes ago, and there are questions in there about the pipes and concrete used in construction. I felt myself going back to that moment. What? Why is this the first time I'm hearing about this? Roger didn't tell me anything, I replied. My mind started spinning with thoughts of the structures, the architectural plans, and the amount of money I had planned. Myra looked concerned. I'm not sure why nothing was said, Bart. I've just read the agenda, and it's raising concerns. Moments later, before we had time to think about it, Roger peeked into my office. You ready, buddy? He asked, looking at me with a smile on his face. Roger, what's this pipe and concrete problem with the Pembroke project? I asked quietly, trying to prepare myself for the upcoming meeting. He waved the question away. Don't worry, we'll get it straightened out right away. Roger, you know I like to know these things before I meet with a client, I said. It's all right, buddy. We'll work it out. Roger said this in a rather dismissive tone. The meeting was an ambush. We walked in. The owners of Pembroke's were already there. I'd met them several times, and they were always friendly. However, when I explained how our business was progressing, they frowned, and their looks got darker and darker as I spoke. What about the concrete and pipe overruns in the Northeast? Peter, the majority owner and CEO, asked. I looked at Roger. He shrugged, saying nothing. Everyone was looking at me. I'll have to check because I haven't heard anything about overspending. However, based on last week's figures, everything was within normal limits. Peter's frown deepened. That can't be. Explain to me why I signed the bidding reports for the last 3 months totaling over $200,000 for extra concrete and pipes? Peter said, looking at me. I stared at him, not knowing what to answer. I looked at Roger again. His face was unreadable, but he pulled out a folder and stood up. Gentlemen, if you'll let us take a look at this, I'm sure we can figure it out. He looked at me. Bart, let's go outside for a minute and figure this out. I followed Roger across the hall to another room where our boss Clarence was waiting. So what did they say? Clarence asked as we sat down. Roger jumped up before I could say anything. He handed the folder to Clarence. They asked about the missing materials as we suspected, Roger replied. Clarence looked at me, and for the first time in all the years I'd worked for him, I saw anger in his eyes directed at me. What are you saying, Bartholomew? The older man almost hissed at me. I was shocked by the intensity of his tone and the hostile look he threw at me. I don't know what to say, sir. I was reported to you last week that everything was on track, no additional materials were required, and I have no idea about those signed statements. I certainly didn't approve them, I replied to my obviously angry superior, feeling the situation getting out of hand. He looked at me critically and opened the folder Roger handed him. So this is the story you're sticking to? Clarence asked sharply. Sir? I asked. Then I looked at Roger. He had a serious look on his face. Bartholomew, I have here requisitions for $206,000. I have a problem with the fact that the payments were made to a bank account that happens to be in your name. Seriously, Bartholomew, this is how you treat me after all these years? Clarence was almost yelling at me. The meeting broke up after that. Both Clarence and Roger took turns accusing me of what they said I had done. Neither wanted to hear about my innocence. Then they brought in a human resources representative, and I was fired for fraud. Clarence told me that he would take the matter to the police, and to top it off, Myra would also be fired under fire because she must have been privy to all of this, working so close to me. As I was being escorted out of the building with some of my stuff, I saw Roger smirking, thinking I wasn't looking. I caught Myra in the parking lot out front, security watching us if we tried to get back in. She looked stunned and was crying, standing by her car. "Myra, are you okay?" I asked, and she whirled on me. "You bastard, Bartholomew. $200,000 of fraud. How could you? I trusted you and you took my job away from me." The distraught and devastated woman screamed at me. "Myra, it wasn't me," I pleaded. "It wasn't you?" She paused, a grin appearing on her face. "Before they pushed me out the door, Roger showed me the signed statements. I saw your signature and I know it. How could you?" She looked at me again. I noticed the hatred in her eyes, directed solely at me. She didn't want to hear that I had nothing to do with it. And I guess that heartwarming story about Kelly was also a lie when I said she was cheating on you. Seriously, you think I don't see the way you look at me when you think I'm not? Once again, the look of pure, unadorned anger at the woman I'd worked with for 10 years caught me off guard. "I hate you," she spat out. "You destroyed any chance I had of getting a new job. I can't believe I had the misfortune of feeling sorry for you. You lie, cheat, and steal, and then you still dare to ask how I feel. Back off, Bart." In all the years we'd been together, I'd never once heard her swear. Hearing her words again, I was shocked. But before I could say or do anything, she slapped me hard. "You've ruined my career. I can't get a recommendation, and worse, I'm tainted by your cheating. I hope it was all worth it, asshole." I stood stunned, my cheek aching from her rather forceful slap. Myra stared at me for another moment before getting into her car and driving away without another word. Not knowing what else to do, I drove home and parked in the driveway. Inside, Kelly was waiting for me. "So the cheating husband comes home with his tail between his legs. Pathetic." She spat. I didn't pay attention to it at the time, but in the days that followed, I noticed that Kelly sounded happy. Not upset or concerned, but exactly happy. What the hell was going on? "Kelly, I didn't do any of this. I don't know what's going on," I said, overwhelmed, confused and feeling like I was about to break. She grinned. "What difference does it make, Bart? I'm telling you this now to get off your ass." Such a contemptuous look I'd never seen before. Well, unless you counted Myra's look a little earlier. There was a knock on the door. "It's for you," she said, still growling at me. Without thinking, I opened the door to a guy in a suit. "Mr. Bartholomew, other?" he asked. I nodded. "You've been served." He handed me a thick envelope and left. I looked into the envelope and pulled out a divorce petition. "Kelly, divorce?" Feeling my world crumbling more and more, Kelly felt the misery building up in me and laughed at my pain. "You're such an ignorant chump, aren't you? But of course it's a divorce. In case you haven't noticed, I've been seeing the same man for the last 6 months. He goes places you don't go. He's interesting, and of course he has a decent amount of money." She looked at me like something you could scrape off a shoe. "As for you, you no longer have a job, no family, no friends. And let's not forget that you're probably going to end up in jail for fraud before the end of the month." She threw me a brief glance, and there was a sadistic look of pleasure in her eyes. I had noticed that look more and more often over the past few months. I didn't understand why I was only seeing it now. "You're pathetic, Bart. My new man isn't as rich, but he's doing things to me that you've never done." "So that's it? You admit you're a whore and a cheat?" I said, anger creeping into my voice. "So yesterday and today you were just enjoying yourself and didn't care about me." Kelly laughed. "Yeah, it was all just for me. I deserved all of it. Didn't you notice that everything was always just for me?" She looked at me, and for a moment I thought there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "We did have a lot of good years together." The look passed, and the bitchiness reappeared. "But you're done with Bart and I'm moving on." Kelly leaned closer to me as my world continued to crumble. "Look, Bart, make it easy for me. I'm asking for the house and most of the property because you'll be in jail, so sign the papers. I'll be generous to you and give you a week to pack up your stuff and move out. But by next week, move out of this house or I'll add a restraining order to everything else. So you're staying with your lover? I asked, feeling the weight of what was happening. Betrayal at my former job and now also from my wife. She laughed again. Of course, his apartment is much smaller, so we'll rent it once you're in jail, but don't you dare stalk me or I'll call the police and have you arrested for stalking. You're already in jail, don't make it worse. I pulled a chair over and sat down, shocked and rejected. Kelly took a few steps toward me. Then she noticed the glowing red handprint Myra had left here earlier. She looked at my red cheek and smiled. Well, at least that slut was let go too. Go die in a hole, Bartholomew. And with those words, Kelly left. I did nothing for the rest of the day, not even a drink. The next day, I didn't know what to do either. I was waiting for something. I tried to call Grace, but the phone kept going to voicemail. After about the 20th ring, she picked up. What do you need? Came my daughter's harsh voice. Grace, I started to say. Leave it alone, Daddy. Grace interrupted me. Her tone was harsh, almost sarcastic. Mom told me about your cheating, about your lying, about you having an affair with your assistant. Seriously, cheating on Mom and stealing $200,000. You've ruined a lot of people's lives, and I can tell you, I've never been so disappointed in anyone in my life. I didn't know what to say back. For a moment, nothing happened between us. But just as I was about to catch my breath and start defending myself, Grace interrupted me again. Look, I'll be blunt, Grace stated hotly over the phone. John and I want nothing to do with you. They said on the news last night that the police were looking into you. And then Mom called and told me everything. Go to jail, Dad. Do your time and stay away from us. I'm embarrassed to say this, but if you're not in jail when we get married, don't come. I don't want a man next to me on my happiest day who can ruin our family like that. I'll find someone else to walk me down the aisle. I didn't answer anything, tears rolling down my face. Dad, are you listening to me? Do you realize how badly you've ruined everything? I answered nothing, but she heard my sobs. Goodbye, Daddy. From now on, you are dead to me. Don't ever try to contact me again, and I mean never. Without another word, she hung up the phone. With those words, I fell to the floor and cried. 2 days later, the police showed up at my door, arrested me, and took me in for questioning. The detectives who arrested me didn't bother to ask if I had done it. Instead, they just peppered me with questions about where I had hidden the money, who my partners were, how long I had been defrauding my former place of employment. Eventually, they let me go, sending me home, but telling me not to leave town because I was due in court the following week. I walked into my house looking around at everything around me. The pictures of Kelly, Grace, and me on the walls, the pictures we had bought, the trophies Grace had brought home over the years for her athletic accomplishments in high school. So many memories and good times now seemed empty and meaningless. The past week passed like a blur. Deep down, I knew I was missing something in this whole situation. I knew I wasn't connecting the obvious dots, but other than the certainty of my innocence, I had no clue. My wife left me, my daughter disowned me. I was fired from my job, my assistant blamed me. Even a close friend treated me like crap and didn't bother to follow up with me. The few calls I answered were answered by now ex-friends talking about their disappointment in me. The scenario repeated itself repeatedly, and they asked me to never contact them again. I was poisoned. Just being around me was unacceptable. I walked to my bedroom depressed, having no idea what I should do next. As an engineer, I was a problem solver, but I didn't know what problem I was solving now. After taking a shower, I went downstairs and ate a sandwich with stale bread and jam, and that cardboard flavor only made my depressing life worse. Maybe I would have gotten through it all if Grace hadn't kicked me out of her life. I stared at the table in front of me. On it stood the bottle of sleeping pills Kelly had used and an unopened bottle of American honey whiskey. For the first time in my life, I had a dark thought of what would happen if I drank and ate the pills. I shook my head. It wasn't a solution to the problem. I just needed time. Early the next day, I received the summons again. This time it forbade me from coming within 100 yards of Kelly, Grace, John, or Roger, and I was to leave the house the following Monday. Despite my growing sense of helplessness, it caught my eye that the ban included Roger, which was odd. Why Roger exactly? Something clicked. I sent him a text message without thinking about anything, gripped by rage and what felt like an open wound in my very soul. You goddamn bastard, this is all your fault. I'm going to beat the shit out of you calling yourself a friend. I'm going to find you and destroy you. I heard nothing in response, but half an hour later the same two detectives who had arrested me again came in and reprimanded me for violating the restraining order by contacting Roger. They were not interested in my explanation. They didn't want to hear my story. They just wanted me in jail because in their minds I was a bad guy. They knew I had to be out of the house by Sunday, and they said I would be arraigned on Monday. They said that a car with a detective would be parked across the street and would follow me for the next 24 hours, and I was urged not to leave the house and just pack my things. Back at the house, after a more than disappointing farewell to the two jerk cops, I was tempted to open a bottle of whiskey. 3 shots in 10 minutes, and I drowned my sorrow. I pulled out 3 pieces of paper, deciding to write a note to Kelly, Grace, and Myra. To Kelly, I wrote that I was disappointed in her. I wrote what a traitorous whore she had been, and that I hoped that when she died she would burn long and hard in the pits of hell for what she had done to me. I cursed her with every vicious word I could think of and then spit on the paper, folded it, and put it in an envelope. To Grace, I wrote my sadness and disappointment that she didn't even ask if I had done what I was accused of. I told her I never did any of the things I was accused of. I never cheated on her mother, and she cheated on me. I told her I never stole money, and the fact that she might have thought I might have done any of those things shows that she needs to grow up and realize who is feeding her this nonsense. I then softened my tone by telling her to love John with everything she had and to think well of me when things settled down. Finally, I asked her to make sure Roger didn't walk her down the aisle in my place since he had betrayed me. This time my tears stained the paper as I put the letter back into the envelope. To Myra, I wrote and apologized. First, I told her that she was in no way to blame for the situation. Then I told a few things I thought I knew about how Roger had betrayed both of us, and he was the one I believed was now sleeping with my wife. I then explained that I was sorry if I had ever made her uncomfortable with my furtive glances. I meant only a timid appreciation for working with such an attractive woman, but I have the utmost respect for her and apologize if my views of her have marred that. I concluded by saying that I felt I had no way out and asked if she could ever forgive me when her anger had subsided. I sealed each letter in an envelope, writing their names on it. Then I grabbed a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of sleeping pills and headed for the bedroom. Sighing, I placed each letter on the bedside table, and then, as if casually, attached a post-it note to the letters asking the detectives to take a look at Roger's finances if they wanted to know the truth. At the end, I wrote that next time they should do their job and not bring an innocent man to what I was about to do. I made it to the bathroom and took a leisurely, luxurious hot shower. I took a couple more sips of whiskey and then chugged all the sleeping pills down with another glass. I wiped myself dry, looking in the mirror and wondering why I was doing this. I'd never been like this, but I had a plan of action, a way out of this mess. If this world didn't need me anymore, I would remove myself from it. On the bench lay my razor. It was a straight razor, as I like to clean shave. I picked it up, took another big sip of whiskey, and as I entered the room, I threw the rest of the whiskey on the bed along with the empty pill bottle. I don't know why, but I dressed well. Pants, casual shoes, and a shirt, and then collapsed on the floor right in front of the bathroom. The whiskey and pills were starting to take their toll on me. I turned the razor over in my hand and looked at the sharp edge. The blade glistened as I pondered its point. Then I noted that it hurt, but I knew it would help no one else tolerate me. They didn't want to see me. They didn't want to hear me, and I would make sure they never saw me again. I was later told that Detective David Roundlight had saved my life. It was he who had been assigned to watch my house that evening from an unmarked car on the opposite side of the road. When Mrs. Hawkins, one of our neighbors and probably one of the few who didn't know what was going on, came to ask about us because there had been a lot of coming and going that week, Detective Roundlight met her at my front door. Receiving no answer to the knock, the detective opened the door and found it unlocked. He walked through the house until he found me bleeding on the bedroom floor. Moments later, an ambulance was called and the house became a crime scene. In hindsight, it was the first respite I'd had all week. I was barely alive when I was carried outside. Luckily for me, I was unable to suppress my gag reflex when I passed out. I was found in a pool of vomit, booze, and blood. An examination was made under the direction of Detective Roundlight. They bagged the whiskey, the pill bottle, the letters, and while going through the house, they found 3 hidden cameras recording on a hard drive hidden in a linen closet. I didn't know anything about them. I lay unconscious for 3 days, and when I woke up, I was surprised to find I was alive. "Where am I?" In a squeaky voice, I asked the pretty nurse. "You are in a private clinic in Hollywood," she replied quietly, then put her finger to her lips. "Shh, shh," she said quietly. "Your friend has been up all night and is just now falling asleep." "Friend?" I raised an eyebrow weakly. "I don't have any friends. They all dumped me?" "Well, this one hasn't," she said, turning my head and finding a very disheveled Myra napping awkwardly in one of those big faux leather chairs you often find in the hospital. "Myra," I said quietly, relieved to see her. Upon uttering her name, she awoke from her slumber. However, as soon as she noticed that I had opened my eyes, she was at my side, her hand sliding into mine. "Bart, what the hell do you think you're doing?" she barked, but her hand held mine very gently, and there were tears in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Though her bloodshot eyes said she'd been crying a lot lately, I turned away from her. "I thought it would be better," I began, shame rolling over me in waves. She snorted. "You think ending your life was the only way to save yourself, Bartholomew the Other. I've known you for over a decade. I've never known you to give up so easily." "What were you thinking?" She repeated her question. For a few minutes, we said nothing, just the hum of the cars as she waited for my answer. "Myra, I'm so sorry. Everyone. I mean everyone. When Kelly, then you, then Grace, I couldn't take it. I never did any of it. No one even asked. I felt like I was backed into a corner. My wife told me to die. My daughter said I was dead to her. My friend betrayed me. And I hurt and disappointed you. I wasn't thinking. I got drunk, and in a weak moment, I did what seemed reasonable to me at the time. I shouldn't be here," I said sadly. She nodded, then crouched carefully on the edge of the bed. "I'm sorry too, Bart," she said quietly, her own tears threatening to start. "I was angry and upset. I didn't stop for a second to think you were innocent. I was wrong." "It's okay, Myra." She pulled me to her. "No, it's not, Bart. The fact that you're here and the fact that you feel like I'm one of the ones who made you. I don't know if I can forgive myself." This time, she began to cry. "It's okay, Myra. It's okay." I closed my eyes from exhaustion. For the next few minutes, we were silent. However, Myra didn't let go of my hand. Eventually, the doctor disturbed us before we could think of what to say. He smiled, looking over my chart as I opened my eyes. "Well, Mr. Other, it's good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" I shrugged. "Alive? Didn't expect to be." He frowned. Myra did too. "Well, we'll see if we can keep you that way," he said, downplaying the significance of my unhealthy comment. He spent the next few minutes examining me. Myra stood back and watched as he untangled my wrists, checking the stitches. Myra sighed as she saw the wounds. He then measured my blood pressure and adjusted the IV in my arm slightly. "We're injecting you mostly with saline," the doctor explained. "When you were admitted, you required 2 blood transfusions since you lost a lot of blood. The saline will help your body produce the blood you need and also provide you with moisture. You will need to eat less for a few days. I'm afraid we had to flush your stomach when you arrived to make sure there were no more pills in it. This is not a very pleasant experience. As a result, you'll probably feel a painful itch that you won't be able to scratch, but you'll be fine. And finally, there is a detective who wanted to meet you when you woke up. He came here several times. Miss Brown talked to him," he finished, nodding toward Myra. I lowered my gaze to the bed as he finished and repeated the warning for me to keep lying down and not move. He put the bandages back on my wrists, leaving Myra and I alone. I couldn't look at her. "So I assume you're here because of my letter?" I asked. She shook her head. "I haven't seen the letter yet, although Detective Roundlight told me about it." Tears threatened to break free. "My cousin works here in administration and found your name on the ICU list. He called me and told me you were brought here after a suicide attempt." Myra said the last word in almost a whisper. I still couldn't look at her, feeling only shame. Myra shuddered, but continued. "I wasn't feeling well anymore, Bart. I was still so angry after I left, but I suspected you had nothing to do with the fraud. I'd been your assistant for years. If anyone knew you were capable of such a thing as trying to steal money, it was me. but I should have stopped for a moment, no matter how angry I was. If I had stopped, I would have realized that you had been set up. When my cousin Morris called me and said, I don't know what's wrong with you. I mean, he told me you were here. I knew. I just knew you didn't do those awful things. I'm so sorry, Bart. So very, 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 very deeply and truly sorry. Myra sobbed, dropping her head to my chest. I could feel her tears soaking the hospital gown. I could hear her whispering that she was so sorry that she had almost lost her best friend. After a few minutes, she stood up and timidly wiped her face. This time, when she tried to pull her hand away from mine to wipe her eyes, I held her back and didn't let go. Then she took another napkin with her free hand, gently wiped the tears from my eyes, and we smiled symbolically at each other. Myra took a deep breath. When I thought about it further, I couldn't understand how you could do something like that. You always loved your job. But when Roger showed me the signed documents, I was so angry with you. She felt me tense up at Roger's name and then tried to look away. It was him, wasn't it? Roger set you up, didn't he? She asked quietly. I nodded. I think so. I can't prove it, but it all adds up. The fact that he didn't tell us about the overspending, the fact that he turned out to have signed documents I've never seen, it all adds up. I also think he's the one having an affair with Kelly. I paused, my eyes closed, Myra's hand still in mine. I'm sorry too, Myra. I never thought Roger or Kelly could involve you in hurting me. But there's nothing I can do. All the evidence is against me. I can't prove my innocence. That's why I did what I did. I fell silent and nothing was said for a while, until a new, unfamiliar voice entered the conversation. Well, I know you can't. They've done a pretty good job of setting you up, forging your signature and making it look like you're a criminal mastermind. But criminals who get away with hundreds of thousands of dollars don't act like you do. The guy who entered the room was a large, very trim man. He looked like he'd played rugby and held himself with a confidence I thought I once had. Mr. Other, I'm Detective David Roundlight. It was I, along with your neighbor, Mrs. Hawkins, who found you. I'm glad to see you're feeling better. I shrugged. I'm sorry, Detective, but I'm sure you'll be able to arrest me in a few days when I'm released, I replied bitterly. I felt Myra squeeze my hand tighter. About that, Detective Roundlight said. Myra and I looked at him. He lifted his hand and ran it through his hair. I've been assigned your case, I'm looking into it, and some things don't add up. Would you be willing to be interviewed again? I think so, yes. After all, I have nothing else to lose, right? I replied to the police detective. What about hiring him a lawyer? Myra asked suddenly. Shouldn't he have a lawyer? The detective sighed. Yes, he could have a lawyer. We don't have to say anything until it's brought up. But yes, he probably needs a lawyer. Myra nodded. She turned to me. Bart, I'll take care of it. She left, letting go of my hand for only the second time since I woke up. As she left the room, dialing a phone number, the detective and I stared after her. She may have been mad at me for what I'd done, but she was still a walking wet dream, and both of us red-blooded men knew it. She likes you, Detective Roundlight said. I laughed. She's been working for me for 10 years. We've both had a pretty bad week, so she's patronizing me a bit right now. I think it's more than that. Off the record, I've read your letters and talked to her. She'll be a little devil to your wife if she ever ends up in the same room with her. He cast a glance at the doorway from which she had emerged. She cares for you very much, Mr. Other, and right now, I think you could use a few people on your side. Detective? I asked, casting a questioning glance at him. He looked at me. I don't think you should be saying that to me. After all, I'm the one you're investigating. He grinned. That's true, Mr. Other, but I think there's more to your case than those two idiots you met thought. Besides, I heard your comments on the way here. You do believe in your innocence, don't you? He asked. Yeah, except for the fact that I got hooked on illegal substances and did it to myself. I held up my hands, showing the bandages on my wrists. Of course I'm innocent. I would never steal money for the establishment I enjoyed working at so much. Well, he said when Myra came back into the room. My third cousin Reagan Brown will be representing Bart. She said it carelessly. Detective Roundlight smiled and handed Myra a business card. I know Miss Brown, she's a good lawyer. She'll take care of you, Mr. Other. He looked at Myra. Have your third cousin contact me as soon as Mr. Other speaks to her. The sooner the better. The three of us talked for a few more minutes before he left. That was unusual, I commented when he left. Yeah, usually the police aren't this friendly or on your side. Myra agreed. We sat for a couple more awkward minutes and I started a new topic. Who's looking after Tilly if you were here? She's at my mom's right now. Also, she reached into her purse and pulled out a drawing. Tilly drew this for you. She smiled and held it out to me. It was a folded piece of paper that Tilly had drawn. It had a picture of a hospital and an ambulance on it. On the inside of it was a crayon drawing of me, in bed, and the words, "Get well soon," written in 11-year-old handwriting. I had to wipe away a few tears. Thank you, I said hoarsely. Have you heard anything about Grace? Myra shook her head. No, I've tried calling her a few times. I left a few messages, but nothing, she said sadly. We talked in silence for about 45 minutes before Myra's third cousin Reagan showed up. After introductions, Myra withdrew and left me with Reagan. Like Myra, Reagan was a beautiful woman. She had sandy brown hair, not platinum blonde like Myra, but seeing them together, you could tell they were related. She likes you, always has, Reagan said at one point in our conversation. Just like when Detective Roundlight had said that to me earlier, I snorted. She knows and has been working for me for years, I replied. This time it was Reagan who snorted. Men! Show they know. I laughed. I think I have an ex-wife that proves I'm not good at anything, I replied without humor in my laughter. She smiled sadly. Don't worry about it. I got the initial information and talked to Detective Roundlight on the way here. Oddly enough, he's on your side. I also have a few theories about what's going on with you, so now that we've talked, leave it to me. Your only crime is that you loved and trusted someone you probably shouldn't have. Reagan threw me a pitying look as she examined my bandages. I'm sorry, Bart. I've heard a lot about you over the years from Myra. She has a lot of respect for you, and from what I know of the past week, she's more upset about the way she treated you than she is about losing her job. She cares about you a lot. I started to formulate a question, but she held up her hand. Don't worry, Bart, Reagan told me. I'll be representing you at your former job for unfair dismissal. If I turn out to be right, a lot of dominoes will fall very quickly. But as for you, right now, in addition to reinstatement, I need the divorce papers filed by your soon-to-be ex-wife. So since I'm representing your interests, what do you want? My face darkened. I want to get as much as I can, I said very quietly. Reagan didn't catch the underlying anger in my tone. Kelly and Roger hung me out to dry and quite possibly walked away with most of the firm's money hanging on me. I give you every right to rain absolute and total destruction on them. She laughed, then winked. Take no prisoners, and don't worry about the body count, got it? I liked my new lawyer. Reagan spent a little more time with me. She asked more questions about what preceded my case of self-mutilation, as she called it, and then said goodbye, letting me know it was okay. Reagan informed me that if nothing happened, she would contact me in a couple days to do a formal police interview as soon as I was released. The next few days passed rather sluggishly after the past week. I just laid in a hospital bed with doctors and nurses checking on me every few hours. I didn't have a cell phone. It was still in the house, so I couldn't call anyone, nor did I think anyone would want to talk to me. But when Myra came over the next day, she brought me an old paperback book, Endymion, by Dan Simmons. I laughed when she held it out to me. It was a book I had read years ago, and it was a great read. As Myra handed me the book, I wondered what she was doing here as she sat down in the chair next to my bed and pulled out her Pride and Prejudice book. Silly man, I'm here to look after you, she replied, shaking her head but smiling. We chatted and talked about what had happened to us during the day. With the doctor's approval at lunchtime, she went and bought me roast beef and gravy and chips, and herself a chicken wrap. Despite the nagging pain in my wrists, I was starting to feel like myself again. Myra was gone for the afternoon, but she came in mid-afternoon, just as the doctors were removing the IV from my arm and informing me that I would be discharged tomorrow morning if my blood tests came back clean. I looked at Myra. I don't know where to go. I don't have a phone or wallet to get a hotel room. I know I can't go home. Myra smiled. Speaking of home, Reagan got a court order to access some of your personal belongings. I managed to get your phone, wallet, A few changes of clothes, laptop, iPad, and shaving supplies. Myra, I said, stunned that she'd done that for me. Thank you. Now I can at least try to find a hotel. I looked at her, my only friend in the world. What's wrong? I asked, looking at her worried expression. She hesitated. You were right about Roger and Kelly. She paused again. When Reagan and the officer and I went to get your things, they were both there. It looks like they lived together and weren't expecting guests. I'm sorry, Bart, she said quietly. I sighed. It's all right, Myra. Well, no, it's not all right. But thank you for your candor. What happened when they saw you? She smiled again in answer to the question. First, they started yelling, telling me to get out, until the officer told them to back off or they'd be arrested for violating a court order. Then the officer let me go into your room to get your things, Myra cried. Bart, the stain, she said, pointing to the spot where my blood was probably still on the carpet. She took a deep breath. It's still there. If I hadn't been here with you since you walked in, I would have panicked. Don't you ever do anything like that again? I held up my hands. I promise, I replied. The next day, freshly washed and shaved at the hospital, Myra met me as I was being discharged and we walked outside together. She took my hand and led me to her car as we walked. We drove for a few minutes until we got to a condominium complex in the Kings Park neighborhood. Myra, what are we doing here? Can't I stay at your place? I asked, realizing where we were going. Of course you can, silly. You don't have to spend money on a hotel. You can stay in the guest room for a few days. Besides, Reagan is meeting us this afternoon. She's up to date on everything related to your case, so I don't think you'll want to miss it. Myra smiled at me. I had been to Myra's house several times over the years. It was a small 2-story house with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a modest kitchen, and a modest living room. Since only Myra and Tilly lived in the house, with occasional visits from her mom, they were quite self-sufficient and fit in perfectly. Having worked with Myra for so long, I knew she only had a small mortgage left on the house. Despite her looks, Myra wasn't a party girl, and I know she was very fond of Tilly. She was where most of her money went. We took my suitcases into her house. Then she showed me the spare bedroom, bathroom, and everything else until Reagan showed up. Reagan showed up about an hour later. She walked in, sat down, pulled several folders out of her bag with a businesslike expression on her face. You, Bartholomew Other, are a very, very lucky man, she said seriously. I gulped. Your wife and your best friend almost tricked you into leaving with everything. I am now forced to inform you that your bank accounts have been frozen. This includes your savings accounts and the account that received the missing money. That account was fraudulently opened in your name. Myra and I looked at each other. Reagan continued. Apparently, over the past few months, your so-called friend Roger has learned how to forge your signature, and a couple months ago, he and your wife went to a local bank and opened an account in your name. I managed to get a videotape proving it was them. I also filed a motion to suspend their passports and started suing them for fraud and mental abuse. They are in big trouble, my attorney informed Myra and I with a smile. I've also started legal proceedings with your former work over the unfair dismissal of both of you, and I think it will be all right by the end of the week. I've spoken to Detective Roundlight and we'll go and have a formal interview with him tomorrow morning. She looked at me. It will be routine. Just follow my instructions and everything will be fine. I expect your wife and friend to be arrested very soon. So over the next hour, the 3 of us discussed the details and signed a number of documents. Reagan knew that all charges against me would be dropped the next day. When she left, I spent a few minutes unpacking my clothes in my room and laying out my toiletries in the bathroom. Myra and I spent the afternoon discussing what we thought would happen next. Then, when Myra left to pick up Tilly from school, I turned on my phone for the first time in days. I was greeted by missed calls and text messages, mostly from Kelly, telling me how pathetic I was and that I just needed to sign a divorce before I ended up in jail. What was even more interesting was that over the past 2 days, I had also received several missed calls from my former place of employment asking me to call back at my earliest convenience. But to my disappointment, there was nothing from Grace. When Myra and Tilly got home, I forgot about my worries as the 11-year-old wanted to tell me about how her day at school went, what they did, what friends they played with, how she told them about me being in the hospital and that I would stay with her until I got better. She was full of energy, and I have to admit I loved it. While Myra cooked dinner, I sat with Tilly. We did homework with her and then read her school book to practice reading. She was a great reader, and I enjoyed reading along with her. Tilly was a mini version of Myra. I knew she would be a heartbreaker when she got older, too. She was so cheerful and innocent, I hoped she would keep that for as long as possible. We ate dinner, showered, and then the three of us sat down to watch TV before bed. Tilly enjoyed showing me the latest episodes of a children's show called Bluey. As an adult, I found it funny, and so did she. Tilly asked me to tuck her into bed and hugged me so tightly that I almost had tears in my eyes. She said she was so happy that it made me feel better when she let me go. I had to wipe my eyes after that as I switched places with Myra, who also said goodnight to Tilly. Although it felt like a lifetime had passed since I had experienced such unconditional love, the fact that my daughter had thrown me under the bus still hurt. Tilly's innocent concern for my feelings felt like a relief amidst the loss of connection with Grace. Afterward, Myra and I sat on the couch again and talked. Often she held my hand, and when we both turned around, she hugged me tightly, telling me everything was going to be okay. The next day, we had a job interview. Both Detective Roundlight and Reagan confirmed that immediately afterward, all charges against me were dropped. That evening, the news showed a story about Kelly and Roger, who had warrants out for their arrest on several charges, including fraud and identity theft. Until now, they could not be found. Later that night, Grace tried to call me for the first time, but I put the phone to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to her. The next day was a bit bittersweet. Grace called me a few times and even texted me a couple messages asking me to call her. But I didn't want to talk to her yet. It took me going through a cleansing process for her to start caring about me. I was furious. She had cast me aside without a second thought and then ignored Myra's calls when I was in the hospital. Now that it appeared that her desire to talk was her mother and Roger's fault, my daughter could eat crow a little. That night, however, when we were all already asleep, I had a nightmare. I was at home, having just shaved with a razor, as Kelly and Roger came into the room and started having fun on the bed. Then Myra, Grace, and John stood in the doorway taunting me while I lay there dying, unable to do anything. I woke up sweating like a pig and screaming at the top of my lungs. Before I realized what was happening, Myra was already standing next to me, wide-eyed and worried. Even Tilly was standing in the doorway with tears on her face. I put my head in my hands and sobbed, "I'm so sorry, I can't." I finally started to calm down, and they both climbed onto the bed with me. Myra climbed on top of me and stayed on one side, while Tilly snuggled on the other. I felt Myra put her arms around me. "It's all right, Uncle Bart," Tilly said. "You had a bad dream. That happens sometimes. Mom and I are going to stay with you. Go to sleep." I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. After a while, I felt Tilly fall asleep. Her small hand lay on my stomach, but I could feel Myra looking at me. "Are you okay, Bart?" she asked with genuine concern in her voice as she continued to cuddle me like a mother hen to her newly hatched chicks. I thought for a moment, "No, I'm sorry, Myra, but I don't think I'm okay. It was that night's dream. I mean, when I couldn't say it." I think Myra realized what I was going to say because she leaned over and kissed my cheek, and then I felt her nuzzle into my neck. "What are we going to do, Bart?" she cried softly. "It's not fair. You don't deserve this." She cried, pain and resentment toward me in her voice. "Shh," I told her, in turn wrapping my arm around her and pulling her to me, trying not to wake Tilly, who was snoring softly at my side. "We'll figure it out. It'll be okay." In that moment, I felt like I had found myself again, if that makes sense. Myra's pain and worry brought me back to myself for the first time since that night. I hugged Myra and Tilly until the sun came up and a new day dawned. The next morning, we had breakfast, after which Myra took Tilly to school. I used this time to start looking for a counselor. I needed help. By the time Myra returned, I had already made several phone calls explaining that I needed help. Myra gave me the biggest smile and then smiled much more seriously. "Bart, is there something we can talk about?" she said, leading me over to the couch, and we both sat down. I looked at her, then nodded, thinking I knew what she wanted to talk about. "It's okay, Myra," I said. "I realized last night was scary. With Tilly here, it's not good. If I wake up screaming, I'll find another place. Her eyes widened. She quickly put her hands on mine, and a panicked expression flashed across her face. No, Bart, that's not what I wanted to talk to you about, she said, then took a deep breath. Actually, it's quite the opposite, Bart. I don't know how to say this, but I just need to. I looked at Myra. The expression on her face was painfully beautiful, but perplexed. Bart, I'm in love with you, Myra suddenly mumbled. Sam, talk about shock when you get information you weren't expecting. I beg your pardon? Said I, like a stupid dummy. I said I'm in love with you, and I have been for a long time. She repeated more modestly this time, and blushed slightly. I leaned back in my chair, and she smiled meekly at me, searching my face for her thoughts. I'm sorry, Bart, but I can't hold back any longer, Myra said, mulling over her words. When I found out you were in the hospital, I went crazy. I couldn't get there fast enough. I felt so guilty that I yelled at you. Told myself I wouldn't tell you anything about how I really felt, but you almost died. Your wife and best friend just lied to you, and when you were discharged, you came here. And I figured I didn't need to say anything because you were here with me and Tilly. I thought you'd figure it out sooner or later. But Myra, why? Why are you telling me what led up to this? I asked. She laughed softly, but I could hear the sadness in her laughter. You silly little lump. It happened last night. You were hurt. It broke my heart to see you like that, but I was there for you and you fell asleep in my arms. I'd like to think I was able to ease your burden. I was hurting for you, but I can't. Bart, I don't want to hold it in anymore. Myra's eyes moved quickly to mine. As to why it was always you. Haven't you ever noticed that I don't go on dates? She said, tilting her head to the side. Yes, I replied, tilting my head slightly to one side as a question mark. But I always thought it was because of Tilly. I said. That's partly true, said Myra hesitantly. But Bart, it's just that I've never been able to find anyone who could match you. I tilted my head the other way, questioning. Myra smiled. Listen, she said, from the moment I started working with you, you've never treated me differently from anyone else. On the contrary, you took the time to explain everything. You were kind to everyone, helping people learn from their mistakes. Whenever you met Tilly, you were friendly and made her feel special, like helping her with her homework or reading with her. She has never met her father. However, she sees you as a father figure. Look how she climbed up to you last night because she knew you were hurting. But Myra, I stared at her. She held up her hand, interrupting me. When everything came crashing down on us last week, you tried to take it out on us. You didn't scream and yell. You didn't treat me cruelly when I threw a tantrum or when I slapped you. Myra blushed. You are an amazing man, Bartholomew the other. I love you for that and for so many other reasons. And if Kelly is stupid enough to throw you away, I'll raise you so that in a month you won't even remember that bitch's name. She walked over and kissed me. It was as if time had stopped. Will you take me, Bart? Will you make me your woman? Myra asked. I had just been proposed to by one of the most beautiful women I had ever met. If I was honest with myself, I would admit that I had fantasized about her in the past. But things were happening fast. I knew that nothing would ever happen between Kelly and me again. And the fact that Myra had fallen in love with me was important, because it made me feel like I wasn't such a loser. But I was afraid it would also backfire. I think Myra understood my inner turmoil, but said nothing, stood up, took my hand, and led us towards her bedroom. Finally, once in the bedroom, we got down to business. Afterward, we fell asleep. In my sleep, I had a dream similar to the previous one. While Kelly and Roger were having fun on the bed, I started to get desperate again. Suddenly, Myra entered the room, ran her hands over my wrists, healing the wounds, and then flew out of the room, away from the scene of anxiety and sadness. We awoke to the sound of the alarm clock. I shuddered and sweated but didn't scream. As we dressed, I told her about the dream. A concerned expression appeared on Myra's face, and she took me with her when she picked Tilly up from school. A few more weeks passed. However, both Roger and Kelly were arrested and taken into custody. They found out that the police wanted to question them after the charges against me were dropped. In a panic, they drove from Perth to Adelaide and were apprehended by Australian customs as they attempted to flee the country. It took 2 months before the Western Australian police returned them to Perth, But in that time, I have to say that my relationship with Myra grew by leaps and bounds. After that first night, I moved into her bedroom, which is now our bedroom, and I have to admit that I felt like I was in my 20s again. I think it's obvious that I've fallen in love with this woman. As the police were taking Roger and Kelly back to Perth, I noted that Myra was right. It was hard for me to remember Kelly, and I didn't want those memories to persist. A month after the horrible couple were brought back to Perth, Myra, Reagan, and I found ourselves in court giving evidence against Kelly and Roger. Roger never looked at me directly, even when I was on the witness stand. He was eventually sentenced to 15 years. Kelly, on the other hand, kept her eyes on me the whole time. During the trial, it turned out that Roger was the mastermind behind the whole affair. He was the one who seduced Kelly and pushed the fraud. So everyone was surprised when Kelly got 20 years. She was found to be an accessory to the fraud, but when she was charged with mental cruelty for her actions towards me, she was given an additional 5 years due to the evidence found on the hidden cameras that Kelly had set up for Roger. Immediately after the verdict, the judge granted us a divorce. When Kelly handed me the divorce papers, Reagan indicated that we split our savings. Reagan also stated that I was willing to sell the house and split the proceeds immediately, because I had no intention of staying in a house where such horrible things had happened. Finally, Reagan also represented to the court that I was willing to act as trustee for Kelly's funds until she served her time. It took Reagan quite a bit of effort to convince me to agree to this. However, it indicated that I was willing to put up with some problems, and it largely prevented a fight with Kelly's attorney over the stupid things they often do in divorce. I was not allowed to use Kelly's funds. I was, however, allowed to invest them along with any other funds I invested anywhere. The court ordered Roger and Kelly to serve their sentences immediately, and in closing argument after the verdict, Kelly's attorney asked that as a sign of agreement, I spend an hour with her before she was taken to jail. After a few moments of hesitation, as I felt the eyes of the entire court on me, I agreed. Yeah. Kelly was still in her court clothes when she was brought into the interrogation room just after the session ended. The room was reasonably well furnished, although the table was bolted down and chains hung from the legs of the chairs so they couldn't be thrown. Still, when Kelly sat down, she looked depressed and beaten, as I had during her betrayal. Her shoulders slumped as she sat down. Unlike in the courtroom, she didn't meet my gaze. Her prison escort told us she would be right outside the door, just knock when we were done. There was no hurry. For a few minutes, we sat in silence. It was the first time we had been in the room since Kelly had told me to do something, which I ended up trying to do. "I'm sorry, Bart," she said quietly, looking at her hands. I was a little surprised that she spoke first and that her first words were an apology. Her last words were clearly the opposite. "Are you Kelly?" I asked, letting a note of bitterness into my tone. She looked up at me, eyes that held tears but didn't spill over. "Yes, Bart, I'm sorry," I wanted to reply and brush off her apology, but she paused classically, raising her hand. I waited and held my tongue. "Please, Bart, let me handle this and then you can scold me," Kelly said mournfully. I leaned back in my chair and gestured with my hand for her to continue. "Thank you," she said brokenly, looking me straight in the eye for the first time in the room. "Believe it or not, Bart, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to me. For so many years, I loved you. And I still do, even though I've done such terrible things. But the worst part is that I knew how much you loved me. You were the perfect husband and lover. But one day I woke up feeling, I don't know, loss." She took her gaze away from me and back to her hands, then continued talking. "You know, probably a few weeks after I first felt lost, things started to get out of control. I started getting mad at you because you still loved me even though I didn't feel it. Roger was working with you on that damn project when he noticed something was wrong with me." She started kneading her hands. It was another month before the affair started. Roger was persistent. He knew what buttons to push. I still loved you, but he knew how to play on my insecurities and get me into bed. After that, he used my guilt to put his plan into action. See, I don't think you ever knew, but Roger was always jealous of your ability to lead. He always felt like second fiddle to you, and it annoyed him. He got the idea of making a client pay a lot of money for something that never existed and pretend you stole it from the company. To my shame, we both conspired against you by setting everything in motion. We opened a new bank account in your name and took it step by step to get you destroyed. We both knew you were loved and trusted without question. And by the time the dust settled, Roger had decided that with you in jail, his money, our savings, and the money we stole, we could settle in another country, and if they ever found out, we would be out of reach. Kelly explained, shaking her head in bewilderment at her own words. All right. Meanwhile, I said, trying to hide the anger in my voice, none of you cared that you systematically destroyed me in the process. She nodded sadly. Yes, I didn't want to at first, but Roger was relentless. He broke me down piece by piece until I was ready, even if I hesitated. For the plan to succeed, you had to be so broken that you didn't doubt anything. You almost succeeded, I said, interrupting him. If it hadn't been for Detective Roundlight and Myra, you might well have gotten away with it. We were silent for a while. Then Kelly asked quietly, "Can I see them?" I realized what she meant and slowly placed my hands on the table with palms up. Kelly gasped, and her tears flowed as she looked at my scars. She started to reach for them, but then pulled her hands away. Outwardly, I sat impassive. However, inside I was struggling with a whole spectrum of emotions, from rage to shame, rushing through my head. It was somewhat frustrating to me that there was a shred of love in her, even after everything this woman had put me through. But I hated to admit it. Apparently, I failed to hide my emotions because Kelly looked up at me and tensed. "I'm sorry, Bart. I'm really, really sorry. I'm ashamed that I pushed you into trying to kill yourself. I, she paused. I'm going to get 20 years without appeal. I deserve it after what I did to you." I nodded, glad she'd do time with no questions asked. She looked up at me again. "Bart?" I looked at Kelly. "Just so you know, you've never been a bad lover. You're amazing compared to Roger. He thought he was amazing, but was almost useless in bed. It all came down to him, and he never took the time to pleasure me like you did. I have no excuse for what I did to you that last morning. I was wrong." We were quiet for a minute. "So you and Myra?" She asked questioningly. "Yeah," I said a little hesitantly. She smiled weakly. "Good, she's been in love with you for years, you know that," said my now ex-wife. "That's what I found out recently," I replied. I was surprised at the passion and pain in her voice when she said the following. "May she love you, Bart. May she heal the pain I have caused you." Large tears rolled from her eyes, but she continued to look at me. "I know I have no right to advise you on anything, but this woman loves you, and unlike me, she would never betray you. She has wanted you for years and has never once made an attempt to seduce you. I failed on my first attempt. She is everything I am not," my now ex-wife sadly told me. "Kelly, I was a little unsure of what to say. "Don't worry," she told me, wiping the tears from my face with her sleeve. "I'll be fine. I agree to your terms. I was surprised that you were so generous and took care of my money while you were in prison. You're a better man than I could have ever imagined." I sighed. "Kelly, I once loved you more than I think you'll ever know. If you had talked to me about your feelings, maybe we could have avoided everything. But I'm trying my hardest to forget everything you've done to me. But just so you know, right now I still hold a lot of anger inside me. I want to scream at you. I want to choke the life out of you for what you said to me. But I can't, Kelly. I'm the one who decided to kill myself, and I'm the one who's going to have to live with it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Bart," Kelly said as we looked at each other again, "I'm sorry I did that to you. You deserve more from me. And I share just as much guilt for pushing you, even more than you do if we're honest with each other. I will always be ashamed. I saw the letter you wrote, and you were right that I will burn for what I did. But I thank God that you're alive." I gritted my teeth for a moment. The feelings playing in my mind were still strong. How could Kelly say these things now? How could she take it upon herself to try and take her anger and hurt out on me? It wasn't fair, so I changed the subject. "I offered to take care of your money out of respect for our years together. You'll have enough to start over when you get out, if you want to." I said this while trying to hide my emotions and still failing miserably. Kelly noticed my thinly veiled attempt to hide, but agreed to change the subject, laughing bitterly. "I'll probably be about 60, and then hopefully that will be enough to retire on." "60 isn't that much," I said. "Keep it up and you'll be cheerful until you're 80. We talked for a few more minutes about how she wanted to get her funds to us. It relaxed us both a bit, but I sensed she wanted to bring up the next topic. "Have you talked to Grace?" she asked, hesitating slightly. I shook my head. "Grace practically told me where to go, that I'm dead to her and accept the lies you and your lover feed her as gospel. It was that conversation that broke me." I looked at Kelly and she flinched at the pain and sadness in my eyes. Kelly, she never asked me if I was innocent. Never gave me the benefit of the doubt. She just threw me out without another word. It was after that phone call that I, I stopped and stood up, suddenly turning away so Kelly wouldn't see my tears. While I was crying, if I had turned to look, I would have seen Kelly sobbing too. She knew I couldn't say that. Turning my back to Kelly, I continued. When I was in the hospital, Myra tried to contact her, but nothing. Then, as Kelly did, I wiped my face with my sleeve and turned around, sitting back down while Kelly tried to wipe the tears from her face. "I'm sorry, Bart," Kelly wrinkled her nose. "Roger and I have organized a lot of things. To my eternal shame, we planned for Grace to turn on you." I nodded. Kelly saw the flash of anger in my eyes, acknowledged her actions, and hung her head in shame. I was about to reprimand her for ruining my relationship with my daughter, but she already knew she had. Kelly had just openly admitted it. "If it makes you feel any better," Kelly said sorrowfully, "Grace cut me out of her life too. I haven't been scolded this much since I was a kid, but I know I deserved it, and more." "Bart," Kelly said suddenly, and the sadness from her voice was gone, replaced by something more insistent. "Our girl needs you. She's scared and angry at everyone. She and John are fighting about everything now, and you know it's not about them." Kelly said more calmly, "I worry about her. It's my fault, but I can't fix anything. I know she feels guilty for the way she treated you, but the fact that you're not talking to her after everything makes it worse." Kelly hesitated for a moment. "Bart, I know I have no right to ask you to do anything." Kelly paused and looked at me again as she continued to knead her hands. "But could you find the strength to forgive Grace? Our daughter needs at least one parent." I realize now that even if I hadn't been locked up for long, the guilt of what I did to you as well as turning Grace against you would have eaten me alive for the next few years, and she would have hated me in the end anyway, Kelly snorted. "It's better that way. It's better that you're the one to take her away. If you were dead, I don't know what she'd do. Please, Bart, for that matter, take care of our daughter," my now ex-wife begged me. "Kelly," I sighed and wondered what to say. "What you're asking is very hard. You hurt me deeply. But you were my wife, not my blood. When Grace told me she wanted nothing more to do with me, that I was dead to her the day after you told me to go die, it hurt more than what you did to me. I want to go back to her, but the pain, Kelly, the pain of what my family did, what our daughter did, I don't know how to deal with it." Kelly nodded. "I understand," she said sadly, knowing I was trying, but I still had a lot to work through. She understood the pain of rejection. She was going through it herself, right now. I sighed, looking at my ex-wife. "Look, Kelly, if anything, I'll try not to hate you. I'm getting professional help, but even with it, it takes almost everything I have not to yell and swear at you. And about Grace, I'm not promising anything, but I'll consider talking to her soon." She looked defeated. Kelly seemed to have aged several years during this conversation. There was nothing more to talk about. She stood up. "Bart, I know it's no use to you right now, but I'll say it again. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I have no excuses, and I know I can never atone for it. I will serve my time, and though I may never get it, I will hope that one day you can forgive me." Kelly snorted again, then looked up at me, wrinkles and age lines clearly showing on her face. "You may not believe me, but I still and always will love you. I may have lost sight of that for a while, but I still love—" We stood there in awkwardness. Tears flowed from Kelly's eyes again as she walked to the door and knocked. Her prison escort opened it. Kelly stopped and looked back at me. "Love Myra, Bart. Give her the love I so foolishly threw away. Live beautifully and hold your head high. There are people around you who love you. Never forget that there is always someone who cares about you, who will help you get back on your feet even in the toughest of times. I lost sight of that, but I'm proud of you, Bart. You're becoming yourself again. Goodbye, my beautiful man. I'll never forget you," Kelly said regretfully as she said goodbye. and walked out of the room. I pondered this conversation. There was no screaming. Kelly had taken responsibility and accepted her prison sentence. As I left the room, a streak of small droplets could be seen on the tile floor in the direction Kelly had walked. I turned around, mourning for a moment for what once was, and then turned and walked the other way. I was led out of the safe zone and into the public gallery, and my mood immediately improved when I saw Myra standing there waiting for me. Even for such a solemn occasion, my assistant-turned-girlfriend looked beautiful. "Did everything go well?" She asked. "Yes," I replied. It was surprising. I was expecting a bunch of excuses and accusations against me, but she took most of the blame and showed an amazing degree of remorse. "What do you think of that?" Myra asked. I thought for a moment, continuing to hug Myra. To be honest, I still have a lot of anger in me toward Roger and toward her. But unlike Roger, I also feel sorry for her. She knows she ruined everything in her life and now she's paying for it. Apparently, Grace has cut Kelly out of her life too for what she did. Myra nodded. For a moment, she hesitated. About that, she looked at me. "John and Grace are here. While you were with Kelly, John came up to me and said they would be at the cafe across the street for the next few hours if you wanted to talk. He knows how upset you are. Apparently, they had a big fight over the way Grace treated you, but she's desperate to see you." I took a deep breath and looked at my lover. "You think I should talk to her, don't you?" I asked. Myra nodded. "Yes, my love. You have a pain in your soul that I can't take away. Only Grace can do that. But if it helps, I will go with you. I will be by your side for as long as you need me. And," she smiled at me, "if you need Mama Bear to come out, I'll still scratch her eyes out. I love you, Bart." She spoke as if she was ordaining the whole world on my behalf. I leaned over and kissed her. "I love you too, Myra." Her eyes widened. This was my first public declaration of love for her. A few people looked at us, lawyers, judges, and criminals walked by, but at that moment I didn't care. Myra was the only person I could see. "Let's go then," I said, and we walked hand in hand across the street. As we entered the cafe, Myra and I immediately noticed my daughter and her fiancé. As we approached their table, Grace was split between running off toward the hills or knocking me down with a hug. I allowed myself the latter to some extent. I opened my arms, Grace clung to me, and after a few moments I felt my shirt become wet as she cried. "I'm so sorry, Daddy," she repeated over and over for several minutes. I looked at Myra, who was smiling, and at John, who didn't know where to look. Finally, after a couple minutes, I pushed her off me and we sat down at the table. We each ordered a drink and something small from the food, and I decided to strike up a conversation. "I was just talking to your mom," I said quietly. Grace nodded. "I heard, Dad. I'm sorry, I raised my hand. Now it was my turn. "I know, Gracie, you're sorry. Your mom explained a lot, but you should know that your words hurt me. Hurt me worse than ever before." At that moment, I felt like I had no way out. One of the few people who I thought at least cared about me, regardless of the circumstances, had abandoned me without a second thought. But what hurt the most was that you didn't even ask if I was innocent. Grace colored a deep red, embarrassment clearly red on her face. "Dad, I—" She squared her shoulders. "No, I have to say it." She said more to herself than to anyone else. I noticed that John didn't say anything, only squeezed her hand in encouragement. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I should have given you time to answer. I should have let you explain everything, but I didn't. I can't put the blame for my actions on Roger or Mom, but they told me how badly you screwed up, how you were about to go to jail, how you were having an affair." She glanced at Myra. "Mom, with Roger's help, kept telling me what a fraud you were. They were convincing. By the time you called, I was so worked up that I said a lot of things I regret now." John nodded. "I suppose that was a big part of their fight." "Dad, when Myra left messages about you being in the hospital, I thought it was all a ruse. After all, Mom and Roger were bullying you anyway, and Myra was the one you were in cahoots with." Grace looked at Myra, then at me. "They said you just wanted attention since Myra was part of your scheme. But it's true, Dad, you were trying to—" She couldn't say the last sentence. None of us could. I nodded, swallowed, and raised my wrist to show her my scars. I'm sorry, Gracie, yes. I was at rock bottom and saw no way out at the worst possible moment. I got drunk and did something I regret. I spoke slowly, swallowing. It was still hard for me to speak, but I knew I had to do it. I had to show my daughter what she made me do. After my confession, Grace cried again, sobbing into her hands. Myra pressed herself against my side as both her and my emotions threatened to snap. For a few moments, no one said anything. John looked at us. I don't want to brush off the seriousness, but I'd like to give Grace a break and calm down. John looked at us and smiled. Can I assume something good came out of all this? He said, gesturing to Myra and me huddled together. Grace looked up, and after a moment her eyes widened. Daddy, you and Myra? She asked questioningly. Yes, I nodded, and then felt I should explain. But it wasn't an affair like Mom told you. I never cheated on your mom. When I woke up in the hospital, Myra refused to leave me. You don't know this, but Myra also believed for a while what Roger and your mom were doing. We made up, and I found out how much that woman loved me. Myra blushed, but wrapped her arms around my waist and then reached up and kissed me on the lips. John smiled, and Grace looked at us wide-eyed, and then seemed to find herself. Thank you, she turned to Myra. Thank you for taking my dad and being there for him when I had a serious case of bad breath. Myra laughed, and that diffused the tense situation somewhat. For the next few hours we talked. Sometimes we discussed our ordeal from an individual perspective, sometimes from a group perspective. At one point, I even had Grace switch seats with Myra so my daughter could give me a hug. I'd love to say that meeting healed all the wounds between us, but it took a few months before we felt open enough to talk to each other without feeling like we were walking on eggshells. Grace and I worked at it, gradually rebuilding our father-daughter relationship. Grace even went to counseling with me a few times. My counselor helped us address some of the gaps and issues, such as trust, that we were never able to resolve after our first meeting at the coffee shop. One of the challenging sessions focused on how I asked Grace not to cut her mother out of her life. Sure, Kelly was a manipulative and conniving bitch, but she was paying the price and was still her mother. She agreed to go and meet with her on the condition that I go with her the first time. It was a difficult meeting. We didn't talk about it much, as there were many hard feelings between the three of us, but Grace made an effort, and the next week, Kelly wrote me a letter thanking me for convincing her. 6 months later, when things had settled down, I asked Myra to marry me. I proposed during a family dinner. Tilly and Grace supported me and said it was long overdue. John shook my hand and told me to take care of her. I laughed, and he smiled, repeating the same phrase I had said to him. Shortly afterward, Grace and John bound themselves in marriage. With my consent, Myra visited Kelly in jail and asked if she would allow her to take on the role of mother of the bride. Kelly apparently cried, but agreed. Tilly was wonderful in the role of flower girl and called everyone my second daughter. From that moment on, I was no longer Uncle Bart and became Dad. After reuniting with Grace, I walked her down the aisle and handed her into the arms of a very proud husband. As we danced between father and daughter, I felt her pressed against me and whispered a prayer of thanks. That night, I felt the last vestiges of reluctance to be around Grace disappear. Later, Grace even sent a series of pictures and a letter thanking Kelly for allowing Myra to perform in her place. I understand Kelly keeps them on the wall in her cell. While the dust of the criminal case with Roger and Kelly was settling, Reagan negotiated a significant settlement for Myra and me in terms of work. For a while, Clarence refused to make concessions, claiming he had done nothing wrong, but a week before our day in court, he made an offer that Reagan rejected. It was low and insulting. Then, 2 days before the trial, he made another offer, which Reagan rejected. But it resulted in Myra getting a big 6-figure sum, and me getting a nice 7-figure sum. For a multi-million-dollar engineering company, our payout was insignificant compared to the damage a public trial would cause. However, rumors had already started flying, and Clarence's income dropped significantly until he retired and sold the company for less than 30% of what it had been worth when I worked there. With the proceeds, Myra and I started our own engineering consulting company. We provided administrative and engineering services. After 6 months, we had 5 people working for us, traveling around the country and helping with major engineering projects. Surprisingly, one of our first clients was Peter Pembroke. He took Myra and me out to dinner and apologized to us. When it all came out, he realized we'd been played and admitted that the project had nearly failed without my supply coordination engineering skills. After that, every year after that, Myra and I received an invitation to any significant Pembroke event, regardless of whether we worked on their projects. Peter was a good guy who got into a bad situation and wanted to redeem himself. We also sold Myra's small house and bought a much larger house just off the road with a stunning view of Kings Park. It was an old 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house, and we spent over 2 years restoring it. It was a fun time. We only took breaks for family holidays, a wedding, and the birth of Grace and Tilly's little brother, Byron. Life got better. I still had bad dreams from time to time, but Myra was my rock and helped me whenever I needed her. More than a decade had passed, and Byron was now a 10-year-old teenager. Tilly was attending university, following in Aunt Reagan's footsteps, and pursuing a law degree. And so, one lazy Saturday afternoon, Grace and John were sitting with us on the front terrace of our house overlooking Kings Park. Byron playing Xbox with my 7-year-old grandson Bruce, and they were trying to ignore my 5-year-old granddaughter Hope, when Grace started talking about her mother. "Daddy, I got a letter from Mommy this week," she said nonchalantly but carefully. Kelly was not a taboo topic in our house, but everyone behaved cautiously at the mention of her. Over the years, I received several letters from Kelly and even visited her a few times. I knew that she was in treatment and that she had a small community in prison. Even though she still had 8 years left on her sentence, she was respected as a model prisoner. "What did she have to say?" I asked. "Among other things, she informed me that she received news last month that Roger had been released," Grace said when things had quieted down. I sipped my Kraken and Coke in silence. "Last month?" I asked, concerned. Suddenly, I felt Myra's hand on mine. "Did she say anything else?" asked Myra to Grace. Grace nodded. "Yeah, she said he came to see her. Mom says he didn't look well. If the letter is to be believed, Roger's inner life has not been peaceful. I'll visit her next week and find out what happened." But she noted that talking to him was not calm. We talked about this for a few more minutes, after which I excused myself and called David Roundlight. Over the years, he had become a friend to me. David was now head of the Major Crimes Unit and had solved several complex cases that had gotten a lot of media coverage. "Bart, how are you, my friend? How's your beautiful wife doing?" he said in a friendly tone, answering my call. I smiled in spite of myself. "Myra's just fine." I paused. "David, I just found out that Roger has been released." I sensed that David had lost his cheerful tone. "Yes, I got the message yesterday. I was going to let you know at the bowling alley next week," he said. David and I bowled on Tuesdays on the same team. From what I read in the report, he was allowed to move to Adelaide. Apparently, he managed to get a job with a small company. On probation, they asked him about you and whether he planned to have any contact with you. He told them that you could rot in hell for ruining his life, but he knew he had to leave because with his record, no one would hire him here in Western Australia. I sighed. Peter continued. The report notes that life on the outside has been difficult for him. He was involved in several fights, losing most of them. He eventually became a librarian to keep out of the way of most of the prisoners. I don't think you'll have a problem with him, if that's what's bothering you." "Thank you, David. That was my concern. If I hear anything from him, I'll let you know," I replied, letting out a sigh that I couldn't contain. We talked about bowling and the upcoming barbecue for a few more minutes before I walked back to the table. When I sat down, Myra looked up at me. "David?" she asked. I nodded. He confirmed that Roger has left and is moving to Adelaide. But of course he hates me to the core. I have to say the feeling is mutual, I told the gathered family. The rest of the day passed a little low-key, but I was with my family and they made sure I felt supported. That night I woke up covered in sweat and screaming from my first nightmare in years. In it, Roger came in the night and tied us all up. He pointed a gun at us and said he would shoot Myra, Tilly, and Byron if I didn't use the razor. I picked up the razor and was about to do what I had already done once before when I woke up to a scream. Myra woke up instantly. I was sweating like a pig and couldn't stop rubbing my wrists while she tried to calm me down. Without asking, Myra called my therapist, who very graciously took the call at 2 in the morning. Mind you, that's what we were paying him so much money for. I explained the dream while Myra cried, snuggling gently against me. Although it upset my wife, simply discussing it made me feel better. My therapist listened to my story and noted that the dream was most likely triggered by the news of Roger's release and the anxiety I felt remembering everything I had experienced during that time over 13 years ago. We agreed to meet again, and I thanked him for picking me up so early in the morning. As we settled down, Myra checked on Byron, who was surprisingly still asleep. Tilly was awake, but after hearing our conversation on the phone, she came back to bed and asked her mom to tell me she loved me. I laid down after using the bathroom and Myra snuggled up to me. Do you really think Roger's going to be a problem? Myra asked, slightly concerned. No, I don't think so, I replied. I think he'll go away and we'll never hear from him. And even if we do, you know we have protection. I hinted at my hunting gear, safely stored in my closet. Myra nodded absent-mindedly. Okay, I'm sorry, my love, that the news of this made you mad. Are you okay? Sort of, I replied. Unfortunately, I think the shadow will always be there. I don't think about those days as much anymore, but it will always be a part of me. But when I think of those times, I usually think of the beautiful blonde who flew in and saved my life. Myra lifted her head and looked at me. I'm serious, my love. I told her, I felt so helpless at that moment. I felt like there was no other option but to end it all. I could have done it all over again if you hadn't been there when I woke up. I realized there was no getting rid of it. Ignoring it won't help. The best thing I can do is to see the ones I love around me as often as possible and remind them of everything I have to be grateful for, and talk to you when I need to so I don't end up in the same place again. Myra nodded. I love you, Bart, she said. I love you too, Myra, I replied. With those words, we fell asleep, and although we didn't always live happily ever after, we had good and not so good days. Yes, there were fights and disagreements, there were more nightmares, but I realized that I had the unconditional love of a woman who made everything possible, friends who accepted me for who I was, and a family who stood by me despite life's storms. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.